Before I began working on this video, I went through my Why No One Plays episodes to see how many champions are made unpopular as a result of their high propensity to be abused in pro play if they're at even a somewhat reasonable level. There's Kalista, Azir, Ryze, that's a big one. Xayah and Rakan to a lesser extent, not as much as they used to be. I think Gnar would fall into this category too. Quite a few of them. If you ask me, champions should be balanced around the majority, not the select few at the very top, but I do understand why they carry so much equity. Because of the lopsided focus though, the balanced team places less emphasis on low elo outside of egregious cases. They couldn't care less if Yorick or Garen have a 52% win rate, since a lot of that has to do with the players, not the champions themselves. Conversely, they'd freak out if Aphelios' win rate is anywhere above 47%, as that would mean he's viable to take over pro play, so it's extremely rare for a champion to struggle finding success due to their status in low elo. One such case is Brand. While he recently got buffed and has spiked a bit in play rate, Brand has been one of the least popular champions in the game for quite some time. Ever since dominating the bulk of Season 6 and 7, he's had a hard time finding gainful and consistent employment in either mid or support. Yet it feels like every time he receives a small buff, he gets nerfed immediately, despite not being deserving of it based on high elo and pro play stats. For today's episode of Why No One Plays, we'll be looking at what keeps dousing the burning vengeance. Brand's average pick rate over the past 5 years or so frequently hangs around 1 to 2%, sometimes less, and though it's gone up a small amount last month thanks to a few handy buffs, he hasn't been doing very well in terms of win rate up in Diamond Plus. But on the flip side, if you take a look at the charts as to go from Diamond Plus down to Emerald Plus, Plat Plus, Gold Plus, Silver, Bronze, Iron, not only does his pick rate measurably increase, but his win and ban rate also scale really well. So to everyone who's typing "what the f do you mean why no one plays Brand, I see him all the time," I'd like to jovially say that you're basically outing yourself as a low elo player. But in all seriousness though, for some of you, Brand might be like the last person I should make a Why No One Plays episode on, but the reason I wanted to make one is mostly because of the disparity between him and other champions. Going off his stats, he's in fact a noob stopper, someone who performs better the lower the skill level of the average player is. So we should first begin with why he's popular in low elo, then talk about why that doesn't apply in upper ranks, and then discuss why he keeps getting nerfed despite performing terribly in high elo even though there are many other champions in the same situation, and how that results in him being extremely unpopular in high elo. Brand may have been released about give or take 2 years after the game came out, but design-wise, he resembles the champions that came out at the start, a very cut-and-dry champion that's archetypal to a traditional mage. Lots of damage and area coverage, good in teamfights, and a decent if not effective neutral game. You know, standard fare. Roughly every mage, whether battle, burst, or artillery, falls into this category. Now what makes some perform better than others in different elos is how much of that pressure can be influenced by outside input, namely enemy champions, which is especially important for Brand. Following the mage rework in mid-season 6, Brand was changed from a general attacker to a combo-based mage, increasing the total amount of damage he could do up front at the cost of lowering damage output over time. So essentially, they buffed his DPS but lowered his DPM. Why does that matter? That's problem 1. Brand's kit is ill-suited for DPS, despite being heavily geared towards it following the update. To give you a better idea, I'll show you his old kit. The foundation of his identity lies in his passive, Blaze. When any of his abilities strike a target, they receive damage over time equal to a portion of their maximum health. You'll notice it's actually a pretty substantial amount too, 8% over 4 seconds. So if you get hit by one ability, then another, you could lose quite a bit of health and chip damage. Back then there was also Liandry's Torment, which had a passive 15 magic penetration to make that damage over time less effective by mitigation, while also tacking on more % health damage per second. In addition, targets that are on fire take increased effects from his other abilities. Functionally speaking, Q, W, and E are pretty much the same pre and post rework. Seer has them throwing a fireball that stops on and damages the first target hit. If they're on fire beforehand, they get stunned for 2 seconds. The only key difference between pre and post is that the stun went down to 1.5 seconds. Pillar of Flame ignites a burst of fire in a circular area for heavy damage. All targets that were burning prior take 25% bonus damage. The big change is to Conflagration, a point-and-click ability that damages the target. Very simple, but if said target is already on fire, then it spreads to nearby enemies. Present Conflagration also behaves the same way, but as of version 10.22, they made it so it always spreads to nearby targets, whether the initial one is on fire or not, instead doubling the spread radius if the target was on fire. The purpose of his E was to serve as a quick way to set his opponent ablaze to get that stun and bonus damage off Q and W respectively, leading to a staple combo of E, Q, W for big trade damage. Finally, Pyroclasm, a bouncing fireball that damages enemies on each hit. It's pretty much the same before and after, with the only difference being increased quality of life for the new one, such as being able to bounce to and from him and briefly slowing enemy targets hit. How is he so different when all of his active abilities are practically the same? It ties back to the way Blaze works. Current Blaze is a two-parter. It still burns enemies for % max health damage every second while empowering his other abilities, but the damage over time was heavily reduced by more than half per stack, forcing you to land multiple abilities if you wanted to do actual meaningful damage. To compensate, if 3 stacks of blaze hit the same target, it generates a ring of fire around them that explodes after 2 seconds, dealing a huge blast of max health damage to the initial target and everyone around them. So the idea is to get that big damage off by landing at least 3 of your abilities, and then hope that you can do the same for nearby targets to stack explosions. In perfect conditions, Brand can do serious damage just from blaze alone. Say the enemy team is clumped up together and you manage to somehow proc 5 rings of fire on all 5 members. That means with a moderate amount of AP, his passive by itself could deal upwards of 80% max health damage to every champion from all the collateral explosions that take place, let alone the damage coming from his abilities, items, and the passive run. That's assuming you can get those rings of fire off consistently, and the problem is, you can't. Prior to his update, Brand was a pretty unpopular champion because he didn't have the most satisfying gameplay. You basically spent the entirety of a match chucking random abilities at your opponent and gradually whittling away at their health. It was effective, don't get me wrong. 8% max health damage over 4 seconds can hurt very easily, but he was essentially all neutral. There was no payoff to landing your combos beyond the damage they individually provided. You could say he was like Teemo, constantly poking you down until you either backed away or got impatient enough to fight him on low HP. The goal of his mid-scope was to give him an actual combo game and a definitive incentive to be picked over other champions, owing to the change they made to Blaze where they gave him that ring of fire. Now you had more of a reason to set as many opponents on fire as possible through W, E, and ultimate. When executed correctly, he can melt through tanks, bruisers, carries, anyone with extraordinary damage. Tanks, bruisers, and low mobility champions are generally more popular in low elo than high speed assassins and skirmishers. In top there's Mundo, Garen, Yorick, Maokai, Urgot, Nasus, jungle has Amumu, Rammus, Shyvana, mid lane has Malzahar, Veigar, Xerath, bot lane has Ezreal, Misfortune, Ashe, Caitlyn. Not that many dash heavy or speedy champions. Also, positional awareness in teamfights isn't prioritized as much in low elo, which is perfect for Brand. The one downside to his abilities is that they all have delays. Seer is pretty easy to avoid. Pillar of Flame takes more than half a second to go off, so sometimes you can just walk right out of it. Pyroclasm is also a very slow fireball that completely disappears if there are no targets to bounce between, so you can negate all of its use by scattering, and most importantly, the Ring of Fire has a 2-second delay, giving opponents more than enough time to get away from whoever's about to explode. It's a lot easier keeping a Malzahar, Amumu, Garen, and Ashe together than a Fiora, Echo, Sylas, and Lucian. Skirmishes are also more prevalent in high elo than full-blown teamfights, so the odds of you getting 5-man explosions is almost non-existent up there. Situational differences can explain why Brand is more popular in low elo, but it doesn't explain why he goes from borderline pick ban to virtually non-existent in Diamond Plus. I think a lot of that has to do with how much Brand should be allowed to get away with. When they turned him into more of a combo mage, even though his damage ceiling increased dramatically, it had the repercussion of lowering his damage floor in the process, creating a wide disparity in how much damage he could do and a mountain of other problems to his gameplay experience. For one, Brand lost a ton of base damage when he was first updated in 6.9. Seer lost 40 base damage and 10% AP, Conflagration lost 60 base damage and 30% AP, while Pyroclasm lost 50 base damage and half its AP. They obviously did this to make room for the explosion damage from Blaze, but that's assuming you're consistently able to get it. That's easier said than done. Aside from cheating with your ultimate, having to get 3 stacks on a target means if you so much as miss even one of your basic abilities, you lose all the damage that goes along with it. Seer is the shortest cooldown ability in your kit at 6 seconds, but even with a lot of ability haste, by the time it comes back up, the blaze stacks are likely gone, forcing it to start all over again. The eruption damage counted for almost half of his total DPS, more in teamfights since the base damage on his abilities was gutted to hell. Old Brand didn't have this condition. You only had to land one ability to get the full damage off Blaze. In fact, it was encouraged to not spam your abilities, since that would reset the dot timer on Blaze while draining your mana. Now you have no choice but to spam QWE as much as possible if you want to get the Ring of Fire off, which is why they had to give him passive mana restoration in 7.20 because they realized how mana hungry he was, but 6 to 18 wasn't enough since you had to use 2 abilities to get that conditional. So in 10.12 they more than doubled the mana regen, but even that wasn't enough. So in 12.3 they made it so simply last hitting the target with an ability can also give you the mana passive, but even that wasn't enough. So in 13.6 they buffed the mana restoration again. That just goes to show you how reliant Brand was on using his abilities. Problem was, the burst ceiling was so high on Blaze that in the event you did successfully pull off a combo, you could single-handedly one-shot everyone. At one point it was 16% plus 1 per 60 AP of their maximum health. Brand could literally do over 100% of a target's max health with just his passive if enough rings of fire exploded on top of each other. Also remember, this was during the height of tank meta spanning from 2015 to 2017. Tank busting options were at a premium. There weren't that many accessible sources of percent health damage on champions, so having this much on a single person was incredible, more so because it was base damage, which is why Brand became more of a support than a mid laner. He doesn't need items as much as other mages who don't have percent health damage. And he was also a decent response to the Ardent Sensor meta, as the burn damage could reasonably counteract the on-hit regen. Over the years, however, more champions came out with tank busting sources, diminishing the reasons to use Brand. At the same time, more champions of mobility came out, making it even more difficult to land your attacks and stack explosions. On top of that, 2018 marked the start of the one-shot meta where everyone, even tanks, were doing crazy amounts of damage and everyone was getting one-shotted left and right, which worked against Brand's win condition of slow, steady attrition. Why play someone who takes a long time to gradually chip away at you when you can just play someone who can one-shot you and move on to the next? That's why they added so many quality of life features to his kit, like the mana refund, his E always spreading to targets, and Pyroclasm being able to bounce off him, to make it less onerous to land all your stuff while making it more forgiving if you miss the combo or two. But even with all that, he's just too slow and too inconsistent for people to want to use him. Not to mention, for the standards of a mage, he's kinda short range. Most carry supports take advantage of the long range to safely attack targets, whereas Brand has to expose himself to tank supporting gauge ranges to do his stuff. Comparatively, Zyra, Lux, and Xerath have a lot more safe and consistent pressure. If that's the case, why not just make him more forgiving? You would think, with all the quality of life changes he got, his win rate should be a hell of a lot better than 46%. They can't, not without making him 60% win rate pick ban OP and low elo. They've tried many times to see if he could get away with a bit more, and every single time they did, he skyrocketed in low elo. For example, in 8.1, they doubled the burn damage to 4% from 2 for a total of 12% max health over 3 seconds instead of 6, effectively bringing him back to more or less the same burn damage as the old Blaze with 1 to 2 stacks on average. Take a look at his popularity chart in Vars Plus at the start of Season 8. Yeah, almost a 15% pick rate and 54% win rate, that's insane. Diamond Plus was also around that ballpark too. So why would a seemingly minuscule change as taking 1 or 2% extra damage make such a big difference? It's because it puts a time limit on your opponent. Brand could tag you with a random ability every so often and you would eventually lose all your health from the burn damage. The only chance that could bounce back without having to recall or waste money on potions were those of built-in sustain. Most mages and marksmen don't have that. Damage over time is so threatening in League, not for its kill pressure, but for its control pressure. Brand's kill pressure is actually not that good, he fights through attrition, slowly burning through your health bar. Once you get low enough, you can just back away, recover health, and be safe, right? Technically yes, but that means you have to recall, which means you're out of lane, which means you're not exerting pressure, which means even though you're not dead, it's as if you are because you're not present. Brand is so good at forcing enemies to recall from all the persistent burn damage he deals that doubling the dot timer means you effectively have the amount of time his opponent can stay on field before having to recall unless they're Vladimir or have a ton of lifesteal. And in the mid to late game, even support Brand can do enough damage to where you can't just ignore him while he's pelting you down. You have to respect him. That's why they keep nerfing him every time they buff him. They can't give him too much free damage, otherwise he becomes too efficient, but without the concession, he doesn't do enough to justify being picked. Other mages can have lots of burst damage or whatnot, since they're mostly flat damage as opposed to percent health, and their damage ceiling isn't as high as what Brand could reach. Therefore, he can never be popular in high elo since that would make him completely oppressive in low elo to an even greater extent than other noob stompers, making him one of the rare few champs who is not balanced by high elo but by low elo. What do you guys think about Brand? Do you think they can find a healthy middle ground for him, or is he forever doomed to be in this condition? Feel free to share in the comments down below. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next one. Take care.